Abdu'l-Baha, the example and conduct of Abdu'l-Baha while in our midst, and then tells us to revive and perpetuate the memory of those unforgettable and historic episodes and occasions. And so we will be weaving through the rest of this week, we will be weaving the guidance and the stories so that we begin that process. I've often thought that it was interesting that Shoghi Effendi had us first look at Abdu'l-Baha and then roll up our sleeves to do our work on all sides of the color line, so to speak. And so maybe part of the reason for that is that Abdu'l-Baha's approach to things is so divergent from our cultural style here in the United States, even back then. And I'm not just talking about the fact that he was bold and courageous and fearless and determined in looking for every opportunity to foster racial harmony within the Baha'i community, outside the Baha'i community, but also the way he went about it was always a cause of unity and never a cause of disunity. And I think for many of us in America, this has been a challenge. And in fact, the House of Justice addresses that in some of these messages where they remind us that we have to rely on the principles of the faith, even when we address this vital and challenging issue. So we're going to start today by looking first at the paragraph that is the last paragraph in the very first section of the extracts from the letters written on behalf of the Universal House of Justice. We'll just reprise that paragraph because it essentially summarizes at a high level of what they say and did say in many letters after that. And then we'll do a deeper dive into one of the letters and then we'll go to some of the stories, if that's okay. So I'm looking on my screen, I'm wondering, Bella, do you like to read aloud? Okay, I won't ask you then. I'm just, let's see, I asked people yesterday and I'm gonna, so Derek, do you like to read aloud?
Sure.
Okay, would you mind reading just the, actually read the second and third paragraphs of the first selection. That's on page 1. It's got the number 1 down at the bottom. It's the letter dated 25 February, 1996. Thank you.
Since the writings contain so much material on this subject, already brilliantly summarized and expounded by the beloved guardian, the House of Justice does not feel it would be feasible or useful to rehearse that which you are already very well familiar. The friends generally need to digest this material, to study and internalize it until they have a profound grasp of the Baha'i perspective on the matters which you have identified as ones on which there are no true unity of thought. For this, mastery of the teachings, there is no effective substitute. In essence, the House of Justice feels that methods should be subordinated to purposes and goals, and are to be selected, adapted, or discarded as they show themselves to be effective or not. In this regard, it has often been observed that attempts which set out self-consciously to arrive at unity often lose momentum unless they lead beyond discussion to some form of action. With respect to principles, it will assist the friends greatly if the issue of addressing race unity can be formulated within the broad context of the social development of the community. The distinctiveness of the Baha'i approach to many issues needs to be sharpened. In our public outreach, we need to correlate the teachings with current thought and be very clear about the basis and assumptions upon which various conceptions rest, and not swallow uncritically whatever ideas happen to be in vogue. Likewise, as a community, we need to be future-oriented, to have a clear vision and to think through the steps necessary to bring it to fruition. This is where consultation with the Baha'i institutions will provide a critical impulse to your own efforts.
Thank you. So we read this this passage yesterday and looked at a few things, but I thought it would be helpful to do a deeper dive into this because this, without this first set of guidance that is more general but focused, it'll be difficult for us then to even just shape how it is we're doing this mastery of the teachings for which there is no effective substitute, okay? So let's go through. And first of all, I wonder, Derek, you were reading that with such meaning. I'm wondering if you have some comments about that second paragraph. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I suspect you've given some thought to this. You have to unmute yourself, Derek.
One of the things that, and I guess this is not just with this letter, but this has been the, I guess the theme in general is, you know, it can't just be, I guess, talk and suggestions and ideas. We have to actually carry whatever we decide to do, we have to carry it out.
Yeah. Any other thoughts that come to your mind?
Also, I like the thing about we have to, well, it says, and not swallow uncritically whatever ideas happen to be in vogue.
Yeah, yeah. So let's just talk a little bit about that right now. Baha'is always find themselves basically on any topic about 185 degrees divergent from current thought. So we have this wonderful movement right now, this Black Lives Matter movement. And of course, every Baha'i would say Black Lives Matter. And yet we see how it becomes politicized, it becomes a cause of division. For some, it's a great cause of inspiration. So we don't demonize any idea out there floating in the world, but we have to keep our Baha'i heads clear because we can easily get drawn into the areas where there are conflicts and where we begin to seek maybe material solutions to what is essentially a spiritual problem. Does that mean we don't march in Black Lives Matter protests? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It doesn't mean that we don't support people when they are trying to understand this issue. No, of course it doesn't mean that at all. What it means is really, at least part of what it means, is that we have to bring our Baha'i selves into every interaction. And as we know from the House of Justice, the solution to this problem is going to take a long time because it involves the changing of hearts. And the Guardian said it first involves the changing of our own hearts. So if you have close friends who have chocolate brown skin or darker skin, and you talk with them about their experience in the Baha'i community, you will find that there is still a lot of treatment in the Baha'i community that is painful to them. So we haven't yet fully solved the problem here in our own Baha'i community. It's also difficult because if we ask our Black friends, well, tell me what to do, that's very difficult for them. I don't mean to be speaking for them, but this is what I hear over and over from my Black friends and from my husband. And so we Baha'is, the white Baha'is have to do their part. We have to be confident that the Black Baha'is are doing their part. Neither of us gets to manage the other guy's row. And right, so if I'm white, I don't need to tell the Black folks what the Guardian says in the Advent of Divine Justice. And if I'm Black, I don't need to tell the white folks what the Guardian says, other than to say, hey, there's a set of instructions here which you could follow. Because the overarching principles that always apply are the principles that lead to love and unity. So if we're consulting about a difficult issue like race, we never, if we have our Baha'i selves present, we never can degenerate to wrangling, to blaming, to finger pointing, to dismissiveness, to patronizing attitudes. That none of that is allowed for a Baha'i if you're bringing your Baha'i self into the conversation, which means, of course, that we all have to develop these capacities so that when the difficulties present themselves, when an issue is difficult, and race isn't the only difficult issue, there's lots of things that are difficult, we bring our whole Baha'i selves to the conversation. So Derek, I see your hand up.
Doesn't that get into, though, part of the cultural in terms of, I feel that one reason why, even among Baha'is, it's uncomfortable to talk about race is because, and from a Black-white perspective, is because we're coming at it from two different perspectives. In my opinion, most white people look at racism from an individual perspective. And I guess what's happening now is making them realize that it's not an individual perspective, whereas Black people have always looked at it as a societal issue. And maybe what's happening now is making a lot of white people say that it is a societal, finally admit that it is a societal issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, and it is. I mean, no question about that. If it's the most vital and challenging issue that faces both the American Baha'i community and the American nation, then we know that that is that it's a societal issue. And then we also have to look at what is going to change the societal issue. And that doesn't mean that laws don't need to be changed, of course. I mean, I grew up in the civil rights era, and we had a lot of hopes pinned on the civil rights laws. And now, all these years, decades later, what we see is laws can only do so much, because until you change the hearts of those in the society, those laws won't actually apply, because as we all say, you can't legislate morality. So does that mean we don't need legislation? Of course we need legislation. But as Baha'is, we realize that that is not going to solve the issue. The actual solution is the change of heart so that people love each other. And how do you learn to love someone? You have, as the Guardian says, an interracial fellowship, spontaneous, intimate friendships that arise. So, and within the and that concept of spontaneous, intimate friendships is the hallmark of the framework for action that the House of Justice has given us with these core activities. Everything we do is in small groups. Our children's classes are manageable small groups where intimate relationships are formed. Our junior youth groups are small groups where intimate and friendships are formed. Our study circles are small groups. We don't have study circles of 50, or 100 people. They're small groups where intimate friendships grow and develop. And the House of Justice says in many of its plan messages that the beginning step in any one of the community building activities that we take is friendship. And they also say that the way in which we work together has to be characterized by friendship, because, as you know, love and fellowship are the foundation, right? So when we bring our Baha'i selves into this conversation, do we have in our minds at all times that what will solve this problem is actually love for one another? That's what brings unity. And then, of course, we're going to engage at the level where people are, but we are not necessarily going to pin our hopes on some of the outward solutions that we see. And luckily, there are many people who are probably better suited than we are to craft legislation and change laws, and we will support all of that. And then we will keep doing what we need to do. So if we can now look at turn to page 2, and I want us to read this last 2 paragraphs there. And so let's see, Bob Parrish, would you read are you on, Have you got the compilation in front of you? You don't know what I'm talking about? Unmute yourself, please.
Yes.
Okay, so if we are to avoid.
Okay, so you want, okay, that paragraph right there.
And the next one after that.
Okay, oh, by the way, it's really good to see you.
Yes! Thanks for coming on.
If we are to avoid becoming entrammelled in the enervating coils of cynicism, which are a characteristic of this age of transition, we must, as the custodians of the forces of love, ground our efforts in indomitable faith. In the future, the cause of God will spread throughout America. Millions will be enlisted under its banner, and race prejudice will finally be exorcised from the body politic. Of this, have no doubt. It is inexorable because it is the will of Almighty God.
Read that again, please.
Okay.
Starting with of this.
This is what makes me an optimistic idealist.
Right.
Of this, have no doubt. It is inexorable because it is the will of Almighty God. However, as the House of Justice has been trying to get the French to understand for some time, the necessary precondition to translation of our community's social vision into reality is a massive expansion in the number of committed, deepened believers who are well-grounded in the essentials of the cause. Those who fail to comprehend the urgency assigned to the objective of achieving a large expansion have obviously failed to appreciate the moral imperative behind this aim.
I'm going to stop you there for just a moment, Bob. It is very seldom, if you think back to the letters from the House of Justice, where they actually make a statement like that, where they talk about a deficit. So for them to say, those who fail to comprehend the urgency assigned to the objective of achieving a large expansion have obviously failed to appreciate the moral imperative behind this aim. So with regard to the question of the elimination of racial prejudice in this country, and you think about how a large expansion, a massive expansion, they say, in the number of committed, deepened believers will have an effect on and actually bring about the elimination of racial prejudice, and how that is a moral imperative. We are not talking about numbers for numbers' sake. We're actually talking about the way in which we will be able to bring about this change is for the message of Baha'u'llah to penetrate more and more hearts, so that those hearts, like our hearts, are motivated to do the work to eliminate racial prejudice from our own lives and from the relationships that we have with others. This is a pretty stunning statement that the House of Justice makes. And I want to take a minute and see if there's any of you that this is maybe lighting a fire or sending off a light bulb in your minds. Any comments? So I tell you, I've been thinking a lot about this one and thinking, who am I teaching? How am I reaching? How far is my reach? Am I being thoughtful about how far that reach goes? How many, have I even done what Abdu'l-Baha said we should all do, and each one of us bring in at least one soul every year? I'm sort of keeping track, because when I die, I'm gonna have to face Baha'u'llah. Now, does that mean I manipulate people? No, of course not. We don't make people Baha'is, but we do have the moral responsibility to offer the healing message of Baha'u'llah to everyone in a clear way so that they can benefit from it. And so friends, we're all part of this conversation. If I'm white, I have a responsibility to teach black and white, right? If I'm black, I have a responsibility to teach black and white, right? Now, some of us are a little more culturally fluent in one or the other of those cultures, but that doesn't mean we don't have that responsibility across the board. And so I just wanted to sort of start us off with that, because I'm really hoping that this thinking, that you'll be thinking through the rest of this morning and maybe through the rest of our class about this moral imperative to actually see a massive expansion in the faith. And we have a framework now. The House of Justice has given us 24 years to build this framework where we now actually have a systematic way that we can deepen people as they come into the faith. We have a systematic set of community building activities that involves the children and the junior youth and the adults. It involves the building of the Mashwak Alaskar through devotional gatherings all throughout our communities. It involves families as we begin to not only teach their children, but bring them in as protagonists. It involves a vision of everyone being a protagonist of their future. It involves us reaching whole populations, whole neighborhoods and whole populations. So we now have a system we did not have in 1996 when the House of Justice wrote this letter. But the moral imperative for massive expansion hasn't gone away. All right, Bob, would you read the next, that last paragraph? Parallel? I think you're gonna have to unmute yourself, Bob.
Okay. Parallel to the process of large-scale enrollment, the institutions of the faith, including those at the grassroots of the community, will gradually come to function with greater efficiency and increasing harmony, thereby enhancing their potential in stimulating the processes of social development.
I would just like to make a comment, and I hope that those of you who are taking notes will take this as a note, that when institutions read guidance like this, they hopefully are reading it through the lens, like I mentioned yesterday, of what is the responsibility of the institution with regard to this. So you and I as individuals read it, we have the lens of our own lives and our own responsibility as teachers of the cause, our own responsibility to do our work so that we are not vertently or inadvertently contributing to the experience of racial prejudice within our own Baha'i community. But then every institution has a responsibility to think in terms of how can they apply this guidance, not separate from the plan, but so coherently integrated with the plan that it will always remain alive. We're going to read another message today where the House of Justice comments that this topic kind of comes into favor and then it falls out of favor, and then it comes into favor and then it falls out of, depending on circumstances in the world. Well, the only way it's going to stay in the forefront is if it becomes coherent and integrated with everything we're doing. So we're reading everything through the lens of race unity, whether we're talking about a children's class or a junior youth group or devotional gatherings or our study circles or the work of the assembly. Because if we set it over here and we have special gatherings to talk about race unity, and people go and they either have a good experience or they say, oh my God, this was so upsetting, whether they're black or white. We have a good experience or we have one of those experiences where we're like, I'm done with this, I'm not doing that anymore. It doesn't, and then it goes away. We've had gatherings, we've had wonderful times together where we've really done the work and it's been important. But when it's sitting over here and it's not integrated, we have that gathering, it's like an event. We have an event, then we go home and life goes on. So the need that the House of Justice has been helping us to understand for the last 25 years is that the way this doesn't go away is that it becomes integral to everything we're doing. And we're thinking through that lens, not to shift or twist it around to some kind of agenda, but rather to realize that the solution for the eradication and the elimination of racial prejudice is this massive expansion, which we have a framework for action now to accomplish. And we will know when we have children's classes, this is the perfect time for the eradication of racial prejudice in all those children's hearts. And then in their families, when we do junior youth programs, this is the perfect time for them to experience the elimination of racial prejudice. This is the perfect time for when they're thinking about what social action do they want to do in their communities, that they would think about race or bullying, or some of the other things that are that need to be addressed. And the kids will know. They'll know. And with a little bit of guidance from the animators, they will be able to focus on maybe some of these issues that they think are so intractable that they can't do anything about. The same thing in the study circles. Study circles, if they read the guidance in the various books that we're studying through the lens of race unity, lots of interesting things will come up. And of course, in our devotional gatherings, this place where we join our hearts together in prayer, are we an integrated group of people praying, or are we a segregated group of people who are praying together? And because those devotional gatherings build such intimate and warm and loving relationships with the people who are praying together, you just can't pray with people without falling in love with them. And so who are you praying with? Who are you inviting to your devotional gatherings? Who are you empowering to hold devotional gatherings in their own homes or with their families? So you see what I'm saying? This is not separate. And if it's separate, it will keep losing it. It has to become so together. So now we're going to look at this. There's a long letter. Let's see. It's the one that is, oh wait, I want to look at one other before that. Let's turn to page 3 now. And the letter dated September 2nd, 2001, it's passage number 4. And let's see, who else can I get to read? Nikisha, are you on? Would you mind reading this passage number 4? You there?
I'm not able to. I'm here, but I'm not able to. Thanks, and I love to read. Thank you.
Okay, all right, no problem. Let's see. Okay.
Larry will read.
Good, great, go for it.
Your letter touches upon a subject of critical importance to the ultimate success of the faith and the future of civilization, since it has a direct relevance to the fundamental principle of our faith, the oneness of humankind. As you know, our beloved guardian wrote extensively about the need to overcome racial prejudice, which he described as the most vital and challenging issue in the advent of divine justice. The answers to the questions you have raised can be found in this very book. However, the frustration that you feel over the painfully slow progress of efforts in this regard can be allayed only if you are convinced that adherence to the teachings of our faith, though only gradually taking effect at first, will ultimately bring about the change you wish for. And if from that conviction, you will exercise patience as you continue in your own efforts to assist in remedying the situation. Patience is as important as persistence in the pursuit of these efforts. This is not a matter of which any amount of institutional action, however appropriate, can alone produce the desired outcome. Success depends primarily and ultimately on the private and public attitude of individuals, and change in attitude, unfortunately, is often painfully slow. As you are no doubt aware, the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States has, for a number of years, been promoting activities to eliminate racial prejudice both within and without the Baha'i community. But it will require the genuine response of individuals over time to guarantee the attainment of this goal.
Now, Larry, before you turn your mic off, do you have any comments about this?
You know, so at first hit, I would just think a steady and slow and intentional addressing of this issue in our daily lives as individuals and within institutions. I think that whole part about being intentional from a spiritual perspective will help guide us as we go.
Yeah, And isn't it interesting that I think it's very helpful for them to acknowledge the painfully slow progress in these efforts. We've all felt that. But they remind us that it can be allayed only if you're convinced that adherence to the teachings of our faith, though only gradually taking effect at first, will ultimately bring about the changes that you wish for. And from that conviction, you will exercise the patience as you continue in your own efforts to assist in remedying the situations. Patience is as important as persistence in the pursuit of this. Now, it doesn't mean that we have to deliberately go slow, right? We can go whatever pace the group will tolerate. You know, if we're with a group of runners, we can run. If we're with a group of walkers, we're going to be walking. So the pace is not the point, the persistence is the point, and patience while we're persisting. And then notice that this is not a matter in which any amount of institutional action, however appropriate, can alone produce that desired income. So even though I mentioned that local assemblies, the regional council, the National Assembly needs to read this through the lens of what can the institutions do, much of what can be done by the institutions is really by the members of the institutions themselves reflecting these things in their lives, and by the institution continuing to foster, to raise these questions. So the regional council, remember yesterday I mentioned that we basically set aside our entire agenda at our last weekend meeting and spent the entire weekend studying this compilation. We weren't done. We couldn't yet articulate what some learning objectives might be. And so we continued on at our next meeting. And that last hour and a half of that meeting, we were able finally to kind of agree on some of the objectives. And you know, the council is learning about framing everything in a learning mode. So instead of saying, okay, we're gonna have this meeting, we're gonna write that letter, we're gonna do this, create this, whatever, we're learning to frame things in a learning mode. So we were asking ourselves, how can we learn about race unity in strengthening the vision of race unity in all of the core activities? And then we said, so how can we learn about in the Institute? For instance, are we actually raising up tutors from the relevant populations? Are those friends being empowered to develop the capacity then to be coordinators, to serve at the regional level? So that, I mean, an institution might ask itself a question like that. An individual doesn't really, we contribute to that by actually paying attention and accompanying people and not being patronizing, but actually strengthening their capacity through encouragement, so that each person can step forward, with greater and greater capacity in the service to the cause. So that's an example of actually just very baby steps that the regional council is taking as we look across the region. Then we looked at devotional gatherings, and our question was, what is the population of people in our devotional gatherings? Does it reflect the reality in the community? And our hope, actually the council's hope, is that the population of those who are engaged with us in the core activities would actually be a higher percentage than what the population percentages are in the Northwest. Because as you know, right now, the percentage of all of the people of diverse backgrounds is smaller than the percentage of white folks in the Northwest. It's just a reality in terms of the population of people who live here in the Northwest. But the council was saying, that doesn't mean our Baha'i representation and those engaged with us in service to the cause should be reflective of that percentage. Why would we be content with that? If there's 1% Black in our, in that cluster, would we be content with only 1% of the Black population being engaged with the community building activities? Well, when you put it that way, no, of course we wouldn't be content with that. You see what I'm saying? So this is the kind of thinking that an institution can do, because it's making very systematic plans. But then you and I, as we make plans, as we reach out in our neighborhoods or to the populations that we engage with, how is it, what if we asked ourselves the same questions? What if we asked ourselves, as we're choosing a neighborhood that we might want to enter into? What if we ask ourselves, who lives in that neighborhood? Who needs to hear the message of Baha'u'llah? Who needs to be empowered, as the House of Justice does, to be the protagonists of their own future? And what if we then deliberately choose a neighborhood that has populations that are much higher than the percentages of the population of the Northwest? So you see, when you gain that ability to think systematically, we can actually really make progress on this front. Because, of course, we're not only going to be, let's say, going into a neighborhood and teaching the Black folks that are in the neighborhood, we're also going to invite our white neighbors to be involved. And then when they're in those small groups, whether it's children's classes or junior youth groups or study circles or devotional gatherings, friendships will form, they'll be fostered, there'll be a loving Baha'i who's helping to set that example just the way Abdu'l-Baha did, and we will strengthen the reach of interracial fellowship, which is in the end the solution for the elimination of racial prejudice. You may notice that the Guardian actually never used the word racism. The House of Justice sometimes uses it, but seems to prefer using the Guardian's terminology, which is the elimination of racial prejudice. And so remember, we're talking about the sort of fad thinking that comes and goes and how we have to be careful not to be caught up in it. It isn't our job to correct people who are anti-racism, let's say. But again, the Baha'is have to be clear-headed. What we know is that the solution to the racism in the country is the elimination of racial prejudice, which will then correct the systemic societal issues in the country. Like I say, it's not my job to correct people who are anti-racism, because I know what their aspiration is. Their aspiration, that's what the House of Justice tells us to look at. The aspiration of the heart, the aspiration of the sincere heart who is anti-racism or anti-Black racism is the elimination of racial prejudice, isn't it? And so I'm not gonna say, I'm not gonna use that terminology, but in my own language, I might be talking about, in the same sentence that they say anti-Black racism, I might say the elimination of racial prejudice in my voice, not to correct them, but just to be participating in the conversation, you see? And then gradually people may adopt that or not. It's not my job to change them. It's my job to clearly tie the teachings of Baha'u'llah into the current conversations, right? Yes, not me. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that that's actually exactly what Baha'is are asked to do, right? I mean, many of us function in different levels at our jobs, right? And with the current events, we're asked to write statements about Black Lives Matters, etc. So within each organization, depending on our where we stand in the hierarchy, you can participate in those consultations about what language do you want to include in those statements. I mean, I know we query even the 29 participants who are here, and you ask what statement has your agency put out about racism or anti-racism, everyone may have a say. So in our clinic, I had the privilege of participating in that. And since I had the pleasure of opening my mouth first, they said, hey, why don't you write it? I said, great. Why? You gave me the choice of doing it. And I exactly wrote, I mean, at least my first draft, but was, including what the House of Justice wrote, which is change only happens ultimately when individuals change their private and public attitudes. And out of 50 other drafts that, went through, that sentence still stayed in the statement. A lot of other things fell through, and they had no idea that that came from the House of Justice.
Yeah. So luckily we do have the clarity of the House of Justice that gives us language. So friends, I want to take a moment now and take a story break. It's not really a story break. It's actually us doing what the Guardian asked us to do, which was to look at Abdu'l-Baha and to see how he modeled this in his encounters with us. So I'm going to actually tell more of the story than you have written in here, but I'll tell you where the short part of it is. And it is, sorry, I thought I had it marked. It's on page 15 of the Abdu'l-Baha and Race Unity compilation, which I really hope you will make use of this. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. It's got many of the major talks that Abdu'l-Baha gave about race unity, along with stories. And if you have stories that are not in here, once you've read all these stories, if you can think of one that isn't in here, please, please, please send it to me, because I would like to expand this. I know it's not all, it's just all I have been able to find so far. Okay, so this is the one, it's number 32. It's about Abdu'l-Baha and the servants. And I just want to tell a little bit of more background about this story and then finish up with the reading of this. When Abdu'l-Baha visited this country, you know, I mentioned Agnes Parsons, who was his hostess in Washington, D.C. She was a very wealthy woman. And not only was she a socialite, but in Washington, D.C., she was one of the leading hostesses amongst governmental leaders, senators, and et cetera, even the president. But she also owned a home in Dublin, New Hampshire, which was the getaway place in the summer for people from New York City and Washington, D.C., which are hot and humid. So this is up in the mountains, it's cooler. And so this is where they would go in the summertime. So she had a 40-room mansion. Sorry, she had a mansion that was more than 40 rooms, 60 or 70 rooms, something like that, on a hillside above Dublin, New Hampshire, and a guest cottage of 40 rooms. So when Abdu'l-Baha, she begged Abdu'l-Baha during the heat of the summer to come and stay and rest in her guest cottage in Dublin, New Hampshire. And he finally agreed. He spent a week in Dublin. He found the cottage, this mansion, too chilly for him, high up in the hill. And after a couple of days, he moved down to the Dublin Inn. But of course, also, Abdu'l-Baha he couldn't just, there was no such thing as just resting. And so one of the things that she had arranged was for him to speak at a luncheon at her country club. And she took it upon herself to school him about how he should, the kinds of topics he might address, and to kind of avoid being too religious and that sort of stuff, because she knew the people that would be coming. And I think that hostess in her just felt like she needed to kind of clue Abdu'l-Baha in, if you can imagine. So on the day of the luncheon, they went. And it was one of those, you know, fancy luncheons with linen and silver and crystal and all the kind of stuff. And Abdu'l-Baha was the perfect guest. He told funny stories. He had everyone laughing. She kept trying, as the hostess, to feed him some meaningful conversation topics, we would now call them. And he completely ignored them and just continued on with funny stories and being the entertaining guest. Never said a word about the teachings of Baha'u'llah or any major social issues. Just was the sort of life of the party in an Abdu'l-Baha way. And when they were leaving the luncheon afterwards, he looked at her and said very sweetly, "I hope that you are pleased with me." Then the real thing happened. He left the luncheon after making this remark to Agnes Parsons, and they walked down to her boathouse, which is still there. When you visit Dublin, you can see the boathouse. At least it was there last time I went. It's the only two-story boathouse on that lake. And the upper story is a big room, like a big great room. There, he had asked for all of the Black servants that served at the country club to be gathered in this upper room. you know, so in this story called Abdu'l-Baha and the Servants, it says, it is essential for understanding Abdu'l-Baha's visit to Dublin to realize that even though the only Black people there were non-resident servants, that is, they were brought in for the summer, were neither famous nor wealthy nor educated, still he met with them exactly the same courtesy and attention he paid to their employers. So he had asked for these servants to be gathered, and he met with them. And it was there during that meeting that he announced the impending wedding of Louis and Louisa Gregory, which The Guardian characterized as one of the outstanding accomplishments of Abdu'l-Baha's journey to the West, this interracial marriage. So now we can look at this story, but I wanted you to have the background because I didn't lift out the first part and put it in here. I should have, but I didn't. He met with the Black folks with exactly the same courtesy and attention that he paid to their employers. This must be seen in the context of an America in which integration did not exist, and an American Baha'i community where, for example, the Washington, D.C. community, of which Mrs. Parsons was a member, had only begun to integrate starting in March 1910, although it had been established long before that. In fact, the Washington, D.C. Baha'i community was among the first in the United States to have a significant African-American membership. The Hannans, who also visited Dublin, were the first to seriously teach Blacks, at first teaching the servants of Baha'is. The first educated and articulate African-American Baha'i was Louis Gregory, a Washington lawyer who became a Baha'i in 1909. At the time of the Dublin visit, all the Baha'is were abuzz with the news that Louis Gregory had agreed to Abdu'l-Baha's request that he marry Louise Matthews, a white English Baha'i in Washington. In view of the state of race relations in turn of the century America, the news was absolutely astounding. A meeting of all the Black servants was organized for Abdu'l-Baha at Mrs. Parsons' boathouse, attended by 28 people. And Mahmoud, in his diary, describes it as follows. A meeting for Blacks was held near Lake Dublin, actually, which is locally referred to as Dublin Lake. At this gathering, the master delivered an eloquent address regarding unity and amity among the Blacks and whites. He spoke of the approaching wedding of Miss Louisa Matthew, a white woman, and Mr. Louis Gregory, a colored man, which is to take place shortly in Washington, D.C. The white people in the audience were astonished to see the influence of the cause, and the Blacks were pleased. Incidents like these are little less than miracles. In fact, splitting the moon in half would be an easier accomplishment in the eyes of the Americans. This meeting was full of joy. I just want to do a happy dance reading that story. And you know, at some point it'd be fun to read some of these stories at feast, wouldn't it? And to have a conversation about looking at Abdu'l-Baha's method and how it was he went about these things, because he was always so subtle. He never preached. He never criticized. He never pointed fingers. You know who he asked to start the first Race Amity Conference? It was that same Agnes Parsons. He wrote to her in 1920, instructing her to have a Race Amity Conference, and then said, of course, you're gonna need some help. And she pulled together a team of 19 society women to pull off this conference that was held in 1921, the same year that Abdu'l-Baha passed. Okay, so now let's go back to this letter from the House of Justice that we're going to read next. It is the one that is, it's the April 2011 letter. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so it starts on page 5, the top of page 5. Everybody got it? Are you there? This starts with the Universal House of Justice appreciates your thoughtful inquiry concerning the relationship between eliminating racial prejudice and participating in activities of the 5-year plan. So this was 2011. 10 April 2011. It's probably among the best known letters that we have from the House of Justice on race, because the individual gave permission to the National Assembly to share it widely. It's often been studied at the National Convention. And so hopefully it's one that is familiar to you, but if it's not, or it's been a while since you looked at it, hopefully you'll renew your acquaintanceship with this letter. Okay, let's see. Karen Thomas, do you like to read? Yeah. We may have, we're going to break this up a little bit. It's a long letter, but could you start us off?
Sure. In your letter, you observe that the many activities carried out in the past by the American Baha'i community to address racial concerns, despite their obvious merit and the results achieved to date, have been limited in their effect and have not been systematic in nature. Your review of such efforts suggests a cyclical pattern with fits and starts in which a certain course of action is presented with fanfare by the institutions. Many believers take part, although others remain on the sidelines. Activities reach a peak, and then after months or perhaps years, attention wanes and the community is drawn to other areas until some incident occurs or a new heartfelt appeal is uttered, thus beginning the cycle anew. Simply to repeat the approaches implemented in the past will surely not produce a satisfactory result. The House of Justice notes that the pattern you describe was a characteristic common to many facets of community life, leading it in 1996 to set the Baha'i world on a new course during the 4-year plan. It wrote, shall I go on?
Yes, and then we'll stop for a moment after the end of this.
Okay.
Paragraph.
Our hopes, our goals, our possibilities of moving forward can all be realized through concentrating our endeavors on the major aim of the divine plan at its current stage. That is to effect a significant advance in the process of entry by troops. This challenge can be met through persistent effort, patiently pursued, but also of vital importance to bringing about entry by troops is a realistic approach, systematic action. There are no shortcuts. Systematization ensures consistency of lines of action based on well-conceived plans. In a general sense, it implies an orderliness of approach in all that pertains to Baha'i service, whether in teaching or administration, in individual or collective endeavor. While allowing for individual initiative and spontaneity, it suggests the need to be clear-headed, methodical, efficient, constant, balanced, and harmonious. Systematization is a necessary mode of functioning animated by the urgency to act.
So, dear ones, this beginning of our 25-year process, which ends at Rizwan, the House of Justice, we all had to learn how to say that word systematization, right? Yeah, I mean, we stumbled around with it a bit. I remember even the counselors were sort of stumbling on it, and they made us all practice saying systematization. Now, almost 25 years into this process, we're still kind of scratching our heads about how to be systematic about all things. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight that. You've heard me already mention some things about ways in which institutions can be systematic. And I would like now to tie this in a little bit to the way that we will be looking at, probably for the next plan, but we're getting a sneak peek at it this plan, the materials that you all have studied or will be studying. In the Northwest, they're referred to as expanding the community at the grassroots. How many of you have had an opportunity to study the material? Okay, so a few of you have. It will roll out across every region and throughout the entire country. So everybody, even those of you who are on the East Coast or in the Midwest or wherever that are visiting, you will all be studying this material because it was developed by the ITC in collaboration with the counselors in North America. And it actually forms the unified vision for action for all of North America. So I'm going to take a moment and just give you a little bit of background about these materials, because you may not yet have heard much about them, and then to make a few comments and then tie it back to this. Because remember, the House of Justice said we need to have our efforts around the elimination of racial prejudice to be completely coherent with the plans. So first of all, we need to know what the plan is. and then we need to talk about how to make it coherent. And the current plan, the sort of leading edge of the current plan, is this these materials. Diane, you have your hand up.
What was the name of the materials you just said?
Well, you're in the Northeast, so they may have a slightly different title. People refer to them sometimes as the Grassroots materials.
Okay.
Northwest, we entitled the document, Expanding the Community at the Grassroots. And we actually put in our document the source of the document, because the document itself is not signed. And so it doesn't, you kind of would just have to know. So if it hasn't been explained in that way, so just watch for something that might be called the Grassroots materials.
Thank you. Thank you.
Or maybe it's going to be called the Unified Vision for North America. That's another possibility.
Okay.
But be sure that you get your hands on it, and I'd be happy to send it to you if you want. If you can't get your hands on it yet, I'll send you the Northwest version. But then it won't be, you know, the materials will be the same, but what the cover page looks like might be different.
Okay, good.
You're in the Northeast. Yeah.
Thank you, Erica.
Yeah, you're welcome. So anyway, so I mentioned, I think briefly yesterday, that in December, just when COVID was dawning over in China, in December, the last weekend of December, the ITC and the Continental Board of Counselors for North America, so all the counselors for North America, called together a meeting of representatives from the national assemblies in North America. So Alaska, Canada, the US, the regional councils from every region in North America. So all the regions of the provinces in Canada, and all 12 regions in the US sent representatives, usually just 2 representatives from each one, because it was going to be a large meeting. Every training institute board also had representatives there, and all of the auxiliary boards had representatives. So not every auxiliary board member even got to go to this gathering, and even so, it was well over 100 people. We spent 3 days studying material that had been pulled together by the ITC, the International Teaching Center, and then consulted with in depth by the Continental Board of Counselors for North America. That material was the harvesting of learning around the world in realities similar to the North America. So Australia and New Zealand, Europe, places where the social reality is somewhat similar. And so they had pulled together the most advanced learning in the clusters around the world, including in North America, and synthesized it down to some basic strategies. And so in this material that you're going to be studying, there's 4 sections. The first is a reminder of the spiritual legacy of North America. And so that first section, you're going to love it, because it reminds you of the visit of Abdu'l-Baha, of the spiritual legacy of North America, of the vision of how North America will contribute to the spiritualization of the world. It's very uplifting and reminds us. Many of us haven't revisited that topic in a while, so it serves as a wonderful reminder. The second topic is around the centrality of the Institute in expansion. So remember, the House of Justice has been saying we have to expand. And in this last few plans, we spent quite a bit of time in the first 2 5-year plans trying to build the Institute. It had to dawn on us what it was. We had to actually agree on what the curriculum was going to be. Then we had to get people through the curriculum. In the very beginning, really, we had no idea what this was all about. And so a lot of us just obediently took the courses. We didn't do the practice. We didn't understand actually a training program as well as a foundational spiritual development program. Many Baha'is objected to it because it was workbook style. They didn't like filling in the blanks. Some of the tutors were very rigid in the way they did the tutoring. Oh my goodness, we went through a lot of growth in that first couple of decades. But, you know, because Baha'is essentially will do what the House of Justice asks us to do, we sort of got through the sequence. But of course, we went through it at a time when we didn't really understand what it was for. We just did it. And then as the House of Justice then gradually introduced the core activities to us, we had clustered, we stopped asking ourselves, what on earth is a cluster? We began to say, okay, I know what a cluster is, I'm in one. We began to think about how to advance these clusters. I mean, really, this last 25 years has been a pretty amazing trip as the House of Justice has molded a Baha'i community that knew how to grow in the 60s in a time very much like now, with a lot of social unrest, especially around race. I mean, it was really, the civil rights movement was what gave impetus to the growth, and it was mostly the young. So remember that. I was one of those young people, and all of my peers were marching in the streets and calling for racial justice, and it coalesced around civil rights at that time. And the faith grew by the tens of thousands. In 1 year alone, we had 35,000 enrollments in the US. That year, before we had those enrollments, there were 7,500 Baha'is in the whole US. And then we added 35,000. And the following year, we added another 20,000. And the year after that, we added another 20,000. So I don't know what the order of magnitude on that growth is. It was huge. And we had no idea what to do with all these new believers. We were shocked that so many people were receptive. I mean, actually, teaching was so easy and people accepted Baha'u'llah so quickly, it just almost began to be just how many declaration cards could you collect in a day as we were going and talking to these very receptive souls. But the consolidation afterwards proved to be the challenge. And gradually, as we struggled with the consolidation, we stopped teaching, unfortunately, because we didn't want to bring in more what people used to call paper Baha'is, right? Now, the House of Justice has spent 25 years building a system in which we can actually scale. We can handle an order of magnitude of growth. We have advanced the process of entry by troops. So now the House of Justice is giving us, well, I mean, you know, the ITC is operating as the International Teaching Center, but you can't imagine that they're doing anything that the House of Justice doesn't know they're doing, right? So the International Teaching Center has given us this vision, I think, into the next plan through this material. So now they've reminded us in this material of the centrality of the Institute for expansion. And I don't know whether it's serendipitous or whether it's by design, probably by design, but the House of Justice through the Training Institute has just released a revised version of Book 1, which is completely revamped. And it is now written so that a person who is not a Baha'i would see themselves in this book. Most of the references to a Baha'i would do this, a Baha'i would do that are gone, and instead it says everyone. Much of the sort of doctrinal teachings that were in there are gone. There isn't a discussion of things like the laws and things like that. It's really about the fundamental spiritual principles. And then thinking about prayer and devotional gatherings are now very integrated into this as a practice. And then of course, the expansion, the section on life and death is also expanded. So it's a-
What book was that, Erica?
Book 1.
Book 1.
Book 1, Reflections on the Life of the Spirit, has been completely rewritten. It still has the same units in terms of the titles, but the content is very different. And it's very welcoming to someone who's coming along this journey and is not yet even considered themselves a seeker, but is drawn by the effect of the revelation of Baha'u'llah on the community building activities. Because we now have enough experience in the community building activities to actually be able to say, look, we're doing this with children, look, and we need you, you're a protagonist. Look what the Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Program does and has the potential to do here in your town with all your middle schoolers. And so now we have a Book 1 that they can go into with complete comfort. And so I don't know if the other books are being revamped, but this one has been mightily revamped. And just a little sort of frosting on the cake, it is downloadable from the Ruhi Institute, something they've never done before. You can go out, download it. They say, look at it. you know, get a group of friends together and study it. You don't even have to be trained.
And it can be downloaded in Spanish also.
Yes. Well, I think so.
Yes, it has. It can. I have.
Okay, good. Thank you, Liz. Anyway, so the centrality to the Institute for Expansion is that if we're going to expand, we actually have to build capacity. The Institute is all about building capacity. If you want to have every child have access to Baha'i children's classes, then, okay, they're just showing, thank you. This is a very quick overview of the material. Thanks. Now let's put the screen back so we can actually see the folks again. Appreciate it. Now you got at least a quick, maybe it's a little taster, so you'll want to see the rest of the materials. The Institute, the reason the Institute is central to expansion is because if we don't create more resources, if we don't have more people who have the vision of the spiritual education of children, more people who have the vision of the spiritual empowerment of junior youth, more people who are gathering others to pray together and then to serve their communities, because the Mashrak al-Askar is about prayer and service, and more people who can tutor these courses and train up these resources, and more people to accompany everybody into the field of service, we are limited by ourselves, by our limited size. And so we cannot really expand. We can't do what the House of Justice said was a moral imperative if we don't understand the centrality of the Institute process for expansion. It's not about, oh, the Institute, we have to go through the Institute. It's about the purpose of the Institute, which is to expand the capacity of more and more people, right? So every one of us has to embrace that and become promoters of it and learn how to start study circles with our friends and our neighbors and our coworkers and everyone else, and begin to engage them in this process of being protagonists in their own destiny. That's the purpose of the Institute, is to provide the basic tools for every human being to be a protagonist of the destiny of their community, their neighborhood, their family. Okay, so that's the second one, the centrality of the Institute. The third one is a concept that the House of Justice mentioned at the very beginning of this plan, and that concept was to think in terms of an expanding nucleus of friends. So an expanding nucleus, you know what a nucleus is, it's got a little heart and then it's got rings around it, and the purpose of a nucleus is to expand. So back in the day, in the time of Baha'u'llah, we were looking at the entire planet and trying to expand the Baha'i community into some parts of the planet. And we were thinking continentally originally. How can we get somebody into the Indian subcontinent? How can we get somebody into Africa? How can we get somebody into North America? How can we get into to Central America, South America? And then gradually, during the time of Abdu'l-Baha, he sent folks a few places. During the time of the Guardian, he began to launch systematic plans, and he identified countries. We opened countries. By the 10-year crusade, he had identified the last 100 or so countries that still needed to be opened, and said that any Baha'i that was the first Baha'i to land on those shores would be called a Knight of Baha'u'llah. They would have that title, the Knights of Baha'u'llah. That effort was to open the last of the countries that did not yet have Baha'is in their confines. So once we had opened all the countries and we elected the House of Justice at the end of that 10-year crusade, then we started looking within those countries. So in our country, we're like, do we have Baha'is in every state? And for a while, we were trying to make sure there were Baha'is in the Dakotas, and there were Baha'is in Wyoming and Nevada and all these various places. Eventually, we finally got Baha'is in every state. And we were building local spiritual assemblies, which meant we were looking at Baha'is in towns. Do we have Baha'is in all the capital cities? Do we have Baha'is in all the major cities? Then do we have Baha'is in the secondary cities? And we had state goals committees. And they were basically looking at their state and saying, where does it need to grow? Then we had district teaching committees, which were portions of states. And they were looking at their portion of the state and saying, what do we need to do to make it grow? Then at the beginning of the 5-year plan, the House of Justice had us look at clusters, which were smaller constructs There were smaller circles on the map, and the responsibility for the growth in that smaller circle, this cluster, actually fell on the believers that lived in that cluster. So we drew the circles very quickly on the map, basically not worrying about where the Baha'is were, but kind of thinking in terms of where people think of themselves as living in the broader sense. And then the people in the cluster, the Baha'is in the cluster, looked to see what needed to happen for it to grow. I mean, that's basically what we've been doing this last 25 years, is putting the responsibility for growth on the folks who actually live there in a smaller circle, a cluster. Now, the House of Justice, at the beginning of this plan, mentions this concept of an expanding nucleus of friends. And you can see what's coming. The circle is getting smaller. It will be nuclei, a group of friends, maybe a couple, maybe a team, maybe, you know, a group of friends serving together in some way. And they will be thinking about their own nucleus. Who are the people in their children's class? And who are their family members? And who are the friends of their family members? And so in this study, you will go back and revisit a portion of what's in book 10, where we looked at the concept of concentric circles as a way to envision expansion. These concentric circles have, let's say it's a couple, and they have a children's class and they have a devotional gathering. So they list the people in their children's class and in their devotional gathering, and the next ring out from them. And then they list all the people that are associated with those kids and those people that are attending the devotional gathering, their families, their friends, if they have neighbors, who's associated with them that are aware of these activities. And then they look, the wider circle is the population. So it could be the population in a neighborhood, it could be a population at a workplace, it could be a population of a town. And the point is that we think about what's the next step to move people closer to the center of activity, which is where the intensity is. And so if I'm looking at my nucleus, I think about my children's class and my devotional gathering and those attendees, and I think about each one of those souls every week and say, what's next for them? Does that child, have I visited their family? How are they seeing themselves as a protagonist for the social advancement of their family or their community? If it's a devotional gathering, I'm saying to myself, you know, what's the next step for each one of the people that comes to my devotional? Is that person is so loving it. I wonder if they would like to start their own devotional gathering. How can I accompany them? You see, so it becomes very systematic and very approachable because it's actually people who you know. So our circle is going to get smaller. Does that mean we won't be looking at the cluster level or the regional level or the national level or the world level? No, it doesn't. But we're now really reaching down to the place where every Baha'i will be able to respond to this call from the House of Justice, this moral imperative for expansion. And then the last section in this grassroots material has to do with mutual support and assistance. A reminder to us that we don't do anything by ourselves and that it's all about mutual support and assistance. It's really about how we accompany one another. And if you haven't taken book 10, unit 1, I really would suggest that you find yourself a tutor and get into that book, because it will really help you understand this concept. And it will also be a very good way to brush up on your understanding about all the elements of the plan, because in story form, it kind of helps you understand what we've been doing all along and what it looks like now. And it's really about accompaniment and the concept that when you accompany, you're not supervising, you're actually just walking alongside. And the person that you're walking alongside is walking alongside you too, right back. Yeah, so anyway, that's a quick sketch of these materials. I hope it has whetted your appetite so that when the ATCs or the board members in your area are ready to field them, that you'll be enthusiastic participants and help some of the friends also be able to study these materials. And please don't make it a one-time study. Because honestly, I think this is a vision for what's next. So if you want to be kind of in the bleeding edge of the thinking and the understanding of where we're going, I would suggest that you become well familiar with this material. The hope of the International Teaching Center is that it would reach every Baha'i. soon. We had hoped that it would be done by May. COVID sort of interfered with that, but it's still a goal. So some people won't be able to join by Zoom, and we're going to need all of us to kind of figure out other ways that we can make sure that every Baha'i who's interested will have had a chance to be introduced to these materials and begin to apply them before the end of the plan. All right, so what does that have to do with systematization and about expansion? This is a very systematic way to go about thinking about whatever it is you're doing. One of the things that the International Teaching Center counselors said to us in that December meeting, and they had only a weekend with us, so they were careful about the words they used and what they emphasized. But Mr. Serrano must have said this a dozen times. He said, if you don't have a list, you won't make progress. And so this concept of these concentric circles or being systematic, part of the systematization is that we all have a list. And some of us try to keep it mentally, but it's difficult to keep it mentally. And then he said, and if you don't revisit the list regularly, daily, weekly, you won't make progress. And when you revisit the list, the question is, you know, as you pray about each soul that's on your list, what is the next step? What's the next tiny, small step? Small steps rapidly taken, the House of Justice says, or what will achieve results. So what's the next small step for each person on your list? For them, what's the next obvious thing for them to gain a greater appreciation of the vision of Baha'u'llah for the advancement of civilization? So that's just a little sidelight. You may not hear that in your studies because there were only, you know, as many people as could be there in Houston. But when Mr. Serrano brought this up so many times, it got my attention. And I realized he's right. If I don't have a list and think about who's on my list and think about the next steps and what I will be doing to accompany that soul, and whatever that next baby step might be, you can't decide for them, but you can certainly decide what your next step might be with that individual. Then weeks can go by and nothing will have happened. Yeah. So systematization actually is a way in which we will be, what did the House of Justice say, more efficient and act with more harmony. Yeah. And so our ability to be systematic is now radically growing. And because we know that the focus on race unity has to be in the context of these core activities and in the framework of the plan. And I haven't really mentioned, but of course it's there. There's two other things that are part of the framework. Participation in the discourses of society, like Nakmet was sharing, that many people are in your jobs, you're writing some statement about Black Lives Matter or whatever, however they're framing it. So we certainly can participate in that. We can also participate.
Black Lives Matter?
Yes. Or we can participate in the discourses with our friends and our colleagues. We can certainly, we can try through social media, although that's often not a very good way to do it because it can so quickly degenerate into divisiveness. But some people are able to do that successfully. And of course, in your fields of work, we all can exert the influence of, what did the House say in the May 9th letter? A clarity of vision. You have to be bringing your Baha'i self to this, not your old political rabble-rouser self that we were before you became into the faith, or not your old, yeah, we have to bring our Baha'i selves to this or we'll just be contributing to the disunity. You know, if you heard Paul Ample's talk a few years ago, he said every day he opens the newspaper and he turns on the news and he starts to feel overwhelmed by the disintegration of the forces of disintegration. And then he has to remind himself that there's two processes at work. One is disintegration and one is integration. And he said the forces of disintegration are doing a good job at their job. So we will let people who are tearing down the old system they're the demo crew. And we're the architects and the architects' helpers, and we're the ones that are actually going to be putting in the framing. And we don't have to be both demo crew and the framers. There's plenty of folks who signed up for demo. And they love the demolition. and they get a lot of enthusiastic joy from that demolition. So let's let them do what they're really good at, and let's do what only a handful of us in the world can do, and keep our Baha'i vision alive while we're in this incredibly rich opportunity, a time of such rich opportunity. When have we seen this kind of opportunity? Really, not since the 60s. And I will be very surprised if we don't see a massive surge of growth in the involvement of people in the core activities, but also in people embracing the vision of Baha'u'llah. If you and I open our mouths, if we make a list of people and we find those words that we need with the help of the concourse to actually begin that process of teaching within the framework. That's why we have to remember the centrality of the Institute. We're raising up resources, not in a patronizing way, but in an actual real way. Okay, so sorry to go off, you know me, I tend to do that sometimes, but I feel like if I'm serving at a regional level, why wouldn't I share what I know with all of you? Because there's only 9 of us on the regional council, you know, and then there's 6 auxiliary board members, 5 members of the RTI board, and you know, that's a handful of people who have a chance to look at things regionally. So of course you should benefit from it. So excuse me, but I'm saying that with tongue in cheek. Excuse me for going off, but I think it is helpful for all of you to see through the experience that I've had. Okay, we're almost done, but I feel like I need to open it up for just if there's anyone who has some comments that they'd like to make. I see some things in the chat. Let's see if there's any questions or comments there. Are there, yes, Karen, please.
I just wanted to say, you know, I'm one of the people hosting the Portland Sunday devotional gatherings. And when this all happened with COVID and we couldn't meet together anymore, I was one of the hosts. We were trying to still do this, and I had to learn how to do this on Zoom. And it's been quite a process. I did it very kind of weekly, you know, not very well, but yet it was kind of put together. I didn't know what I was doing. And then I got some help from Dalton, and he showed me how to use Google Slides to make a presentation. And I thought my brain was going to explode because it was so much to get and so much to gather in my head. But I finally have it down, and I can do a Sunday devotion with the writings and music and pictures, and we can stop and do the prayers together and discuss things, and it's really great. Then I asked if somebody else would like to help, and Roger Nesbitt said he would help, and so he put one together. And you know, I accompanied him because he had trouble with the music, and I had some music already, you know, in my library that we could throw on there real quick, and it all worked out. But I love that we're able to do it, that we're getting there. It's a challenge, and it's really hard sometimes. This Zoom is just a whole different platform. But I just encourage everybody to keep working on it, and you'll see it gets easier. And I am just pleased. I'm so pleased that I can do it.
Yeah, thanks. Cassie, are you leaning forward, wanting to unmute yourself? Okay. Anybody else? Yes, Nadia.
Nadezhda.
Nadezhda?
Nadezhda.
Nadezhda, thank you.
We will start open our mouths if somebody let us doing this. Sometimes we not have possibility for talk. And I want to mention today was one comment of child. He's accidentally tell, oh, black people is very important. I want answer for whole group and for this child. Yes, very important. 2 years ago in National Geographic was a very large scientist research about all human kind of humanity came from Africa. And this only in many years something scheme change because change situation in the climate change situation in the world. And this like huge argument for our lighting race prejudice. In future, maybe this will be our argument for this.
This will be our, say that again, the last part, your voice dropped.
This will be like the best argument for lighting race prejudice. Mm-hmm. Because we came from one cell, from one nucleus. And thank you for letting me talk.
Yeah, no, I'm glad for you to participate. Are there any other comments that people have before we close?
I do.
Yes, please go, Liz.
One thing I have been trying to, I've been going down to our local weekly protests, actually Saturday and Sunday afternoons. Mm-hmm. And I've been thinking about how does one do this as a Baha'i? And so, you know, number one, I'm not going as a Baha'i formally. I'm not, you know, presenting myself as a Baha'i. Two, there tend to be four corners. One is white nationalist, one is anti-white nationalist or Trump or whatever they are. One is in general peace people, and one is a corner that's sort of nonpartisan. And, you know, there's very, very general, just supportive, not negative. And so I go over there, and if someone comes over with a partisan thing, I say, you know, I'm kind of over here specifically because this is sort of a nonpartisan area. Is that all right with you? And then sometimes people will ask, what's that about? And so that's a little teaching opportunity. And then I'm just slowly forming relationships, you know, with some of the people that are there, not trying to present any point of view other than, you know, we're there in support of, you know, of the fact that Black Lives Matter as much as everybody else's. Mm-hmm. And that maybe that's not showing up in the world right now. So that's one thing, is that, you know, if you don't have a list of people to talk to, you can create new relationships. So that's my main point there. And then the other one is I'm wondering about sharing with certain friends these letters, these downloads that are the basis of this of these sessions. And I wanted to ask you, is that appropriate?
Yes, it's actually this is a question which may help us sort of close out the session. Some years ago, our Continental Board of Council member Sonia Hearn, who lives in Albany, was with a group at the regional level, and she said, you know, if we're not sharing the guidance that we are studying, we're being patronizing for the people that we are bringing into these activities. So she said, when she has youth that are in the Institute in order to begin junior youth groups in her neighborhood, and or to start children's classes. She says, if they don't have access to what I have access to, it's patronizing. So not only is it okay, it's actually, if we really see everyone in the world as a protagonist for the social advancement of their families and their communities, then why wouldn't we share the guidance of the Universal House of Justice? They're not just for us. This is the universal house of justice. Baha'u'llah's teachings are for the whole inhabitants of this planet, not just for the Baha'is. And we really have to kind of break out of this thinking about the us and them outside of the race question, which we struggle with thinking about us and them. We have to stop thinking about Baha'is and people who aren't Baha'is in terms of the kinds of conversations we have with them. Because them is us and us is them. It's true in the black-white situation. It's also true in those that have not yet embraced Baha'u'llah's revelation. So if you, now sometimes, you know, Baha'u'llah did say you have to use wisdom. You don't feed a baby meat, you know, so a person may not be ready to actually tackle the House of Justice letters, but if you feel like they would be, or you want to study them together so that you can gain an understanding from that perspective, why wouldn't we want to do that? And let's question ourselves that if we think we're somehow in a better position to understand the teachings of Baha'u'llah or the guidance of the Universal House of Justice, then I think we may find that we're actually just, we have a patronizing attitude. Because they're writing, this same guidance is going to every corner of the planet, every kind of person, every tribal population, everything. And honestly, friends, the areas where people are not as well educated and as materially well off, they're the ones that where the advancements are being made. And let me remind you again of Widening Embrace. If you go back and watch that video and look at Widening Embrace, where is it that the local spiritual assemblies have been elected and are now acting as the head of the village? It's not here in the US. It's on a Pacific island. Where is it that the Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Program has emptied the jails? It's not here. And it's on another Pacific island. Where is it that there is actually an inroad being made for the elimination of the caste system? It's in a cluster in India, where Friends and Friends of the Faith studied the Institute materials, took them to heart, and decided to not teach their children what caste they were born into. No one told them to do that. They read the message and the teachings of Baha'u'llah, they embraced them, and they changed themselves, like you and I are all changing ourselves. So I'm so glad you raised this question, Liz, because this is something all of us have to be constantly aware of. Are we gatekeepers? Are we gatekeepers into our cultural, the cross-cultural involvement that will end up, could bring interracial unity? And are we gatekeepers to the message of Baha'u'llah? And what does that actually mean? If we think that someone that we know couldn't understand the message of Baha'u'llah, which was written for him or her, and perhaps our own inherent sense of superiority, and in this case, I'm not just talking about the white folks, because American culture has an inherent sense of superiority that may invade everybody's being. If we have that patronizing attitude, we're slowing the progress. Yeah. So one of the things you'll learn in the Grassroots material is to see everyone as a protagonist from the very beginning. So we have to relearn how we invite people to to whatever it is that we're inviting them to. I'm having to learn how to invite a person to a devotional gathering and not say, come to this wonderful devotional gathering, you're going to feel so spiritually uplifted, which is true. But then I'm the hostess, you're the guest, you come have a nice time, and you go home. So what if I say all over the world, people are trying to learn about the effect of group prayer on the advancement of civilization? Would you like to join us in this learning process? Right? Then a person knows what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, and they're not coming to have a good time. They're actually coming to be shoulder to shoulder. And then they'll be thinking about it. And then I will benefit from their vision, which is not circumscribed by all my Baha'i experience. So when we invite children to children's classes, or we talk to their parents, it has been our practice to say, we have this wonderful children's program for your children's spiritual enrichment. Come, bring your children to us. We will spiritually enrich them. You'll be so happy. Right? No, we can't. I mean, yes, that was good. We are of service, but it's not a service to the community if we're not empowering them from the very beginning. So if one child grasps this and says, I want my friends to be in this children's class because I think it's important for us all to have however they might say it, and they go and they invite, they bring me along to invite. And I spend my entire trip with them around the neighborhood as they're holding my hand, going from friend to friend. my goal is to empower this child, to accompany this child, to build capacity in this child. And so when the child turns to me and says, oh, can you explain about the Baha'i faith to the parents? I'll do it at the first doorstep. On the way from the first doorstep to the second doorstep, I'll say, do you think you could do that now? If a parent asks you that question, and if the child says, sure, then my job will be to stand back and, you know, ready to help, but let the child be the one who's telling the parents about what the Baha'u'llah teaches. This is a transformation in thinking. And you can see, if we transform our thinking in this way, don't you think it's also going to affect the way in which we treat people who are unlike ourselves, whether I'm white and you're black, or whether you're black and I'm white? You know, however we relate to one another, this is going to change if we are seeing everyone through the eyes of empowerment and building capacity, and everyone being a protagonist. Yeah. Yes, Dave Gregory, that's exactly how I'm feeling. Yes. So, friends, I think we've gone.
Touchdown.
What? Say that again.
Touchdown.
Yeah. All right. So, I will see you again tomorrow. We will pick up in this this April letter that's a couple of pages long. I hope we get through it tomorrow. And I hope this has been helpful and useful to you. And please read through all those stories. And if some of them are favorite, text me tomorrow in the chat if there's some that you would like to read, so that I can empower you to be the protagonist of what you want to see happen in the material and how we're going to be using the materials. All right. I love you all. We'll see you tomorrow.
Aloha, friends.
Aloha.